joining us today on Entrepreneurial Impact. Joe Martin and Dave Donaldson, your hosts. And before we even start anywhere, if you're tuning in for your first time, give us a follow, give us a listen. I promise you're going to get some great nuggets today. And I want to kick it over to our guest today, who's going to be talking about the economy with me. And what's cool about it is that she's not a numbers nerd, and we're actually going to have some fun banter with it. So Lisa, I'm going to kick it over to you. Give us a little bit of background about yourself, and then let's dig into like what 2024 has to hold in store for us.
Yeah. Hey, Joe, thanks so much for the invitation to be with you all today. It's funny. I am a little bit of a numbers nerd, so we're going to nerd out a little bit, right, on some data. What I'm really been interested in, though, and really passionate about over, the last couple of decades is, helping real estate professionals be able to use data and information on the housing market, on the economy, so that y'all can be a resource, right, to your clients and your colleagues and your community, really, because those working in real estate are really on the ground who are helping people make really, really important decisions. And so I love being able to present data and talk about information and trends in the economy and the housing market, hopefully in a way that resonates with people and where they can tell a story with the data. And I think given how uncertain everything is, both in the economy and the housing market, sometimes it's hard to wade through all that. And I really like the idea of trying to parse through on what's important and what we should be paying attention to.
There's no lack of interest, I can assure you, as to what's about going on in the market. So there's nothing better than having the chief economist for Bright join us, because I think, unfortunately, too many of our listeners and real estate agents across the globe get their news from the wrong place.
Yeah, and I think we can talk about that a little bit too. I think one of the biggest challenges right now, though, is a lot of people are just getting their information from a source that is providing a national picture, and that might have been okay during the height of the pandemic, where every market kind of looked the same. But as we come out of the pandemic and as markets are reacting differently, it's more important than ever to be getting your information from a local source. From what's going on in, Arlington, Alexandria, DC is different than what's going on in Baltimore and Howard County, what's different than going on in California and Florida. So, making sure we're paying attention to local information is I think, more important now than ever.
This one then, Lisa. There's been a trend of social media posts about Fed Powell doing 6 rate cuts next year. How do you feel about that one?
I don't think that there's going to be 6 rate cuts this year. You mean this year in 2024?
No, you're making me happy because there was a whole other episode that I did with Dave, and he was like, "Yeah, 6 rate cuts." I go, "No, there is not 6 rate cuts. There is nothing on Google. Go type in Fed Powell 6 rate cuts 2024. You will find nothing on it." I don't know who decided to make their own fact in the past 90 days about that, but there is nothing.
So anyway, on the internet, it's got to be true.
It's got to be true. Well, and it's interesting. I think there was a lot of consensus for a while that the Feds were going to cut rates in March. And I don't know. I think it's possible we could be looking at their June meeting before we see that first rate cut. And I think the reason is because, twofold is the labor market is still really strong. We had a really strong December jobs report that came out, and inflation is still holding pretty sticky. As you guys all know, we want inflation down to 2%, and it's like being on a diet, right? When you go on a diet, you lose the early weight first, and it's really easy, and then it's those last 5 pounds that are tough to get off, and we're in those last 5 pounds with inflation, and so it's going to take a lot to get there, and so I think they want to be really careful not to cut before we're sure that we kind of have crossed that inflation sort of threshold
of inflation. So when you're talking inflation and you're talking about CPI, that usually excludes household consumption, which I think everybody on this call or that's listening needs to understand is that normal CPI excludes it. And or when they talk about because it's important to understand that the normal median household that's talking about trying to, at least in the DC area, has got to be making around 160,000 to actually have a living here to live okay and survive. That what inflation typically impacts consumption around groceries, gas, heating, utilities. And most of the time when you see that in the news, they're actually discounting inflation because they're taking those key components out of their metric, which can be deceiving.
Yeah, it's a little complicated. So I will say the headline CPI number that is out there, I think it was 3.6% in January. I might be wrong on that, but the headline CPI number does reflect the sort of full basket of household consumption goods, including food and energy. So when we see that headline number, it does include all those things we buy, from airline tickets to bread at the supermarket, to eating out, to getting a haircut, to filling up the tank. What it doesn't, and the biggest part of it is, frankly, shelter costs, right? The money we put out every month to rent a house. It doesn't include buying a home. We can talk about that quirk too in a minute, which is a little weird. But yeah, you're right. The level that the Fed is watching is that core CPI that excludes food and energy. They tend to be a little more volatile. They move with the weather, and they move with like global issues. And so I think when they're talking about inflation at 2%, they're looking at it that core. But let's be very clear. Even though inflation's coming down, it's not that prices are coming down, right? To your point about, consumers are still feeling like stuff feels more expensive than it did last year. Oh, by the way, it's 3.6% more expensive than it was last year. And I think we are going to be in this new era of higher prices, even when the inflation rate comes down.
And that's
we're sort of resetting at higher prices
back
for a lot of
everything
things.
is cyclical and impacts each other, is that you had rates of people's compensation go up. So if compensation goes up, there has to be a past cost to the consumer. So everything becomes it compounds on each other. Like one issue becomes another one,
right? Absolutely. And it is really, really hard to cut wages after you raise them, right? We don't see that very often.
The one that I've been tracking that I don't think has a lot of like eyeballs on it is the delta difference between the U.S. debt consumption and the U.S. savings. So when you saw back in, let's call it April of 2020 or even June of 2020, so a couple of months after the whole thing collapsed in March and then came back up, is you had a massive surplus of personal savings that, based on the numbers I've been watching, the surplus became a deficit in December of this past year of 2023 because the spending of U.S. households exceeded their savings. And that has been probably kicking the can on a lot of the GDP, or not kicking the can, but it's inflated the GDP that we've seen over the past 2.5 years, 3 years, increasing. So my question, because I've been watching that, because I think that's actually going to be the more of the black swan event that actually causes some form of collapse, because you're also now seeing credit card debt for personal consumption start to increase as well. So what are your thoughts on that one? Because that one's been the one I've been watching the most.
Yeah. I 100% agree. I think we know that the economy is driven by the consumer, right? 70% of GDP is based on consumer spending, business and government spending, and some import exports, the remaining 30%. So what the consumer does is super important. And we have been on a revenge, spending, spree. We weren't able to spend during COVID. We saved a lot of money, and we've been spending a lot of money, and that has to slow down. It just, as you're saying, it's unsustainable. And so as we see credit card debt start to rise, as we see savings rates get back to more typical areas, we're going to start to see that show up in the GDP numbers. So we're seeing, I think most of the projections are for GDP to grow by about 1% next year. We've been at 3, 4, 5% in 2023. And I think that reflects primarily that slowdown in consumer spending. It's interesting, though, we haven't seen it yet, right? It was a really good December for consumer spending. Mm-hmm. We were still spending a lot of money. So when does it kind of start to slow down? Because as you rightly point out, we kind of are in a deficit. So I bring that one up just because
I think it's important to bring up, because if you start to see the debt go up, you're going to have your debt to income ratios for qualifying for loans are going to have a problem, and you're already having the issues of we're having 8%, or now we're down under 6.5%. But the issue that I look at is that this is where, I don't know, I would love to have your perspective on what's going on with the federal budget and the fact that they keep extending the budget line so they don't shut down the U.S. like the U.S. government doesn't shut down. Because right now, based on where the federal funds rate is, I forget how much it is, but they can't keep their budget based on what the federal debt is. That's why it didn't make any sense to me that they didn't go after the Fed, even though it's independent from the U.S. spending, because it's the central bank is not they're completely neutral. But now you've got this debt, this interest payment that is crippling to the U.S. budget, because now the federal funds rate is like 4 times what it was 3 years ago. And so what are your, like, how does that impact our economy? But
Sure.
also how does that impact at the local level, the housing industry?
Well, I think that it's funny, we focus a lot on like the Federal Reserve and what they're going to do on rate hikes or rate cuts, when sometimes people focus on that a lot when they're trying to figure out where mortgage rates are headed. But the biggest factor in the mortgage market right now, I think, is this issue of the kind of ballooning federal debt, and that the interest payments on that debt is going to lead to bond yields remaining higher than they would. The government's going to have to issue a lot more debt in order to pay off the interest. And so that's going to result in higher yields to attract investors. And as the mortgage rate follows that yield on treasuries, we're going to see mortgage rates remain elevated. I think that's the primary reason why we're going to see rates stay in the sixes, mortgage rates stay in the sixes, because of the issue that the government's gotten ourselves into, where we have this huge debt to pay off. Look, we've had a rising budget debt and deficit for a long time. It cracks me up. Like it's like everybody's surprised, but we can see it coming, right? You see the spending. It's like you just have to add it up. And it has been a constant in politics to kick that issue down the road. And I guess I'm not a political person per se, but it feels like we're going to have to decide how we want to handle this in the future. And there's only two answers: raising taxes or cutting spending. And no politician in there is.
Yeah, you don't win the votes by talking about raising taxes. Or,
yeah, it's an election year. I wouldn't hold my breath on that.
Right. And I don't mean to be, and I don't want to, let me be very clear. I think there would also be people who say that, we don't want to talk about this, I'm sure, but the other way to do it is to improve efficiency and to make the economy more efficient per person worked or whatever. And so I know there's a lot of talk out there about AI, and I'm really interested. I know nothing about it, but I'm really interested in how and if that would change our economy, and frankly, if there are implications for the housing sector. But again, that may be a topic for a totally different conversation.
Because anytime there's a change, a monumental shift or change in policy, procedure, or how things affect people's jobs, right? Whether it's the invention of the tractor, right? To now we hear AI. AI's been around for a while. It's now hitting the mainstream. So people are scared of it, right? So they need to get ahead of it and understand how to embrace it, to utilize it in the day-to-day, therefore leverage it in their careers and not be afraid of it, and then see how things change.
So for everybody listening, the reason I brought up the aspect of the ballooning federal debt and what Lisa just brought up about the bond yields is that the reason I led everyone down this rabbit hole is that for anybody out there that thinks your interest rates are somehow going to get below 6% this year or next year, you can track the bond market and that will tell you exactly where that's going. Currently, one of Lisa's stats was that the spread in between the 10-year and 30-year fixed is 280 basis points, so 2.8%. And about 2019, if you were using that as your baseline, I think the spread was 160 basis points. Mm-hmm. So what you're seeing is that there's this spread because there's this huge interest payment that the federal government has to pay. Hence, they have to increase the bips that they're taking in as margin to pay off. So what you're also hearing is they're issuing future debt to pay off current debt. And anybody that's played the shell game of robbing Peter to pay Paul, eventually the cash runs out and you can't keep shifting around the shells. So that's why it's important to understand what your legislation's doing for taxes, what they're doing for incentives. And it goes into a whole nother ramification of like the U.S. tax system that the U.S. government, you say you read the 400 pages of tax code, 80 pages of it tells you how to file your taxes. The other 320 pages tells you where the government wants private money invested, and they will give you benefits on said capital gains or other delayment of tax payments. So I say this because if I'm a real estate agent, I have to realize that consumption's going up, debt's going up, interest rates aren't going to move anywhere in the next 24 months. So defining reality is imperative to be like, smart in the future. So these are all things to realize is that where we're at currently is probably the best it's going to be or where it's going to be for 24 months. So how do I become a master of the current environment, knowing full well that like, this is where we're at. So that's why I wanted to kind of land those couple of questions with you, Lisa.
And I think this in-depth analysis, and then it's complicated for look. Like Lisa's an economist, Joe plays one on TV, and I'm just a real estate agent. Okay, but so for everybody else, these are hard things for them to digest, right? So getting to that granular level is important to understand that yes, rates aren't going to move, but the bigger factors are this, right? And you mentioned this to tee off, that focus local, right? Mm-hmm. Look at your inventory. Lisa, is inventory going to fluctuate in such a degree that's going to affect home values? Is it going to affect demand to a degree that it's going to bring down prices? Right.
No. But may I elaborate? I never want to be the person, because people have done this before 15 years ago. I never want to be the person who stands up and says prices aren't going to fall the day before Lehman Brothers goes under or before home prices fall. Right? No. But so you spend a lot of time thinking about what would make home prices fall, right? And there's two reasons: supply increasing significantly or demand contracting significantly. And I can't see where the new supply is coming from, right? In our market, in the DMV in particular, we're not building a ton of new housing. Sussex County, Delaware, a little bit of a different story. They're building like gangbusters out in Sussex County, Delaware, a lot of new housing construction. In most markets, though, we're not. And then demand, if you think about folks who are in that first-time homebuyer age, people in their 30s, homeownership rates for that group are much lower now than they were for similar ages 10, 20 years ago. In fact, if the homeownership rates were the same for this current group, we'd have 750,000 more homeowners in America right now. There is significant amounts of pent-up demand. So I can't see any reason how demand will shrink. What we do need to be concerned about, though, is we are hitting affordability ceilings, right? We are putting people out of the market who are going to stay renters longer simply because the numbers don't work anymore. And I've been sort of amazed at how first-time buyers in particular in our market have been able to make the numbers work. And it has taken a little bit of creativity sometimes. It's taken a little bit of compromise and trade-offs on the type of home or where the home is. People are making it work, but I don't see demand falling or supply increasing enough for us to see major
conversations with people all the time. And there's a tremendous difference between the market collapse of 2007, right? Economically speaking, real estate speaking, right, and the effects of that to where we are today, right? However, where we are today is due to some of the residual changes that took place back in 2007. And for a lot of people that got into the business, heck, a whole generation of people got in and got out of the business between then and now. Like I was one of the few that got in 2007 and I'm still here, right? But I lived that experience in Arizona on the ground. Well, here's what I really, really see. You touched on it by construction standpoints. There was a tremendous amount of construction in the areas most heavily impacted that was ground zero in 2007. The builders hit the brakes, pumped the brakes, and stopped for the better part of a decade from mass building. We are now today feeling those ramifications at enormous levels, right? And that's why we can't catch up. One of the major factors, just one.
Do you know why? Do you know what the biggest hindrance for most builders putting out inventory, if you were to ask them? So I've never looked at the stats on this one for like professional surveys. But for the builders I know in the DC metro area, Northern Virginia and DC, it's the zoning issues that they don't want to deal with the headaches of rezoning it, HOAs, ANCs, council people throwing their like nonsense at them where they're like, you know what? I don't really want to build up here then because you're going to give me all these headaches of what I got to go through for permitting, rezoning, special use permits, all that kind of stuff. You know what? I'll go out to south of Richmond or outside of Richmond where I can buy up land for cheap and deliver the thing and not have any of these these constraints. So I'm understanding a lot of builders have those things, and that's why they're not building in certain like highly densely populated areas because they're running all these like locks.
Yeah.